Hello, friends. Recently, I was digging around in some files on the old computer and I stumbled across the original draft of the Alfred and Livonia story, which I published last year as The Potion Dealers. A number of you have read it. This book is like the book of my heart. I have a number of books that are very near and dear to me. All of my books set in my Hidden Lands fantasy world are like my book babies, but The Potion Dealers is like my favorite of all the babies. And the first draft, if you can call it that, and the first draft of this book, I think I started it in 2005 or was it 2003? I would need to go look it up again. Either way, it was a long time ago. It was more than 20 years ago. I was in the first half of my 20s. I think I was 23, so I think it was 2005. And I made some videos on this channel where I look back on my teen writings and laugh at how absolutely stupid they are. I don't usually go back to writings from my early 20s, but I thought there might be some interesting kind of craft chat involved in looking back at this book from my 20s and what struck me about it as I was rereading it and kind of cringing my way through it. Because the thing about like teen writing is like, of course it's bad. You know it's going to be bad. It's going to be hilariously bad, and it is. But the writing of my early 20s is not cringy bad in the same way. It's bad in a subtler way. And this is kind of that point in a writer's journey that we sometimes don't talk about as much. There's like the beginning phase where you're just not great at anything, and especially if you're a teenager, but even if you're an adult who's new to writing, you might write some things that are just very amateurish and cringy, and you're just not really doing anything right, to the point that the result is actually just kind of funny. But a lot of you, I know even just from the times I've done like critiques on the channel, a lot more of you watching are probably more in that you're definitely not a beginner. You clearly have talent. You clearly have a grasp on some of the basic elements. Maybe your characters are really fantastic, but the prose isn't quite there. Maybe the plot isn't quite there. Maybe nothing's quite there, but everything's pretty good, to the point where it gets a little harder to see what you're doing wrong. When I look back at this original draft of The Potion Dealers, if you can even call it that, at this early proto stage, it's a little harder for me to explain just why it's so bad, because at this point I have gotten a lot better at a lot of things, but the sum of it still is bad. And I remember when I was writing this book, how deep in the zone I was with it. I felt like I was just in this flow state. These characters were so amazing. I loved them so much, like they were so real. Now when I look back at this, I'm like, really? That's what I thought while I was writing it? Because, oof. But you know, that's the way things go. That's why sometimes time and just to keep at it are the best ways to have perspective on what you're doing wrong. Now, another thing about this manuscript is I wrote it just before I started to really seriously study the craft of writing. Prior to that, I had been, kind of trying, I'd read a few books at the library on writing craft, and I had a couple of critique partners. So it wasn't like I had no information, but I hadn't really taken things very seriously. And of course, it was also getting a lot easier to take things seriously, because the internet was starting to become more like the modern internet, where you could find resources more easily. In fact, in a lot of ways, we were kind of heading into what I would think is like peak internet, where there was not yet this obnoxious social media. But, the mid-2000s was actually a pretty great time for the internet in a lot of ways. There was a lot of very organic networking and friendship building and community building, and nothing was really so monetized yet. There were a lot of sites that were kind of established and full-fledged. So there were a lot of message boards. You could really get like media information. But this manuscript preceded all of that for me. I had writer friends, but I wasn't really treating it like it was going to be my job yet, even though I did want it to be my job. So the origins of this story are very random. if you read The Potion Dealers, you would barely even recognize this original draft at all. The circumstances were completely different for the characters. And this story also was, like, looking back, the one thing that really strikes me about it is I was maturing in the sense of my themes and ideas. It marked a pivotal moment where my themes and ideas changed from like teen writing to adult writing. And the biggest thing about that is I had always had some manner of blind character in the story since I was little. When I was a kid, I had a traumatic flu or something where my eyes, when you have a bad fever and your eyes are like really hot, and I'm laying in bed watching like network TV, as one does in the 90s. And so little reruns of Little House on the Prairie were on TV. And it happened to be the episode where Mary goes blind. She's had a fever and now she's going blind, and the light is fading, and there's like a lantern, and she almost sets fire to the house because she doesn't see the fire in the lantern or something like that. I haven't watched it since that day, but I still vividly remember this like lantern, the fire. She's like, the light's fading, she's going blind, and meanwhile I'm laying in bed with like my eyes on fire, my face so hot. And I started to freak out that I was going to go blind. And of course, I also had just recently gotten glasses in like the last few years, and I had to go to the eye doctor a lot, and every time my eyes were worse. I really don't have very good eyes to this day. Like I'm definitely one of those people where the eye doctor's always kind of like, you better not take too long to come back. You could have, you're at a high risk for eye problems. So the whole eye thing was very traumatizing to me as a kid, and I think I started to write blind characters as a way to like make that seem less scary. But I also had just a general, like, I like to write characters that were like physically different in some way, and I think that is more just because I felt like I was a weird kid and I was always struggling to fit in, and writing characters that had something kind of obviously misfit about them, like a physical disability, or they were a different species, they had wings, something like that. It was like a way of me coping, making it a little more concrete as to why they were different, as opposed to in my real life where I just felt like I was different and I didn't know why. So I always had these characters, but they generally, all of my main characters, whether they were blind or not, generally had absolutely miserable, tortured childhoods. Like, everybody ostracized them. Their parents were horrible. They were like outcasts and bullied, and people were just so mean to them. And like, they would fall in love with a girl and then she'd get murdered. Like everything you can imagine. They'd get in a fight and incur additional injuries and scars. They would be from some oppressive society where, if I could possibly think of a way to torture them, I would. And if I thought of a new, fresh way to torture a character that I hadn't previously used, I was like, hot damn. So all these characters were these misfit characters that were just, all of society was so mean to them, until they finally found, their people, their partner, their found family. So the thing that really set the Alfred and Livonia story apart is that Alfred was a blind character who was a pretty happy, relatively not too traumatized guy. He definitely had problems, as he still does, but it was the degree of trauma and outcastness and torture and all of that had been dialed way back with Alfred. It was the first time that I had a chance to like really create a fresh character group that was not so tortured. And part of the reason for that is because I had a role-playing partner, an online role-playing partner girl, that for some years, since I hit adulthood and I was no longer playing pretend games with my sister, I had this role-playing partner. And, my characters were basically existing in this text role-play. But then she got really busy with college, and she was dating somebody new, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. She was kind of like, I don't really have time for this anymore. I was heartbroken, and all my characters were kind of tied up in this story. So I was like, I need some new characters. And who should step into the void? These two new characters who also I matched with a couple of other new characters, which is Lester and Thessia, who had kind of come into the story recently and weren't really intertwined in the role play in any kind of big way. They became like my new character group. And because I had created them in my 20s rather than as a 14-year-old like my previous character group, they immediately demonstrated a lot more just thematic maturity on my part. And that is one thing that really struck me as I was reading this story compared to like my teen writing, is that I was definitely more interested in nuances and smaller problems rather than everything being turned up to 11. But with that said, I did not really know what I was doing with these characters. They kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't plan them. The backstories were strikingly different than if you read The Potion Dealers. If you read The Potion Dealers, Alfred has lost his sight because of a curse that was placed on his family, an ancestral curse that his grandfather was blinded, and then when he dies, his youngest descendant becomes blind instead. So Alfred lost his sight when his grandfather died, and he was a baby. But in the original story, the character of Livonia actually came first, and it was her family that had the ancestral blindness curse, except it worked very differently. It was just every descendant of like her great-grandfather or something would slowly lose their eyesight over time. So when Livonia was a child, she was slowly losing her eyesight, and then in her young adulthood, her brother managed to find a way to break the curse, and suddenly the curse was gone and she could see. She was written into the story merely in the context of a side character who had this background, and I wasn't really doing anything with her. Then Dade was playing Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas, and the character of Woozy, the blind crime boss, popped up in it, and I was very enamored with his character and the concept of this blind crime boss. And also just kind of like what a good friend Woozy was to the main character in Grand Theft Auto, and kind of what like a chill dude he was. So that was kind of the origins of Alfred, was like, I liked the contrast between this dangerous crime boss, but also just like, what a good friend. What a just nice, chill guy who's very personable. And at the same time, he has this big vulnerability. Although in the game, of course, doesn't really have that big of a vulnerability. He's like running around racing cars, like media. Blind people are never really usually they're overpowered. So I decided I was going to kind of rip off this character and put him into my world, and he became Alfred. And then I was like, it would be fun if I paired Alfred with this side character girl who has this background of she lost her sight slowly and then got it back, and she kind of doesn't know what to do with herself. The whole thing's a little jarring. I was playing with a theme that will pop up again of like, if you do have something about you that's different, and maybe a part of you yearns to be like everybody else, but then if you actually get your wish, is that as easy to grapple with as you might have thought? And is curing or fixing a problem always really as helpful as you, or actually in some ways society, might think that it would be? And I decided I would just pair them up and just like see what happens. So in this original story, Alfred shows up and he has stolen a document from his father. Alfred is the heir to the crime family, but he also has this like treasure hunting adventurous streak, and he really likes to go poke around in ruins and like is into history. This part of his character was established from the very beginning. So he's stolen this document from his father that his family was trying to keep from him because they didn't want him to go running off on a dangerous treasure hunt, which makes him mad. He wants to go on a dangerous treasure hunt. So he needs somebody to read it to him. He leaves Atlantis, his home city, goes to a different city where nobody knows him, and is looking for someone who could be a reader for this document, someone that hopefully isn't going to like tell his family. He just wants a normal kind of person. He ends up with Livonia. That's kind of one of her side gigs she's been doing. And Livonia was a very kind of stick in the mud character. In fact, she was written as kind of a semi-antagonist. that I was writing this little story about her brother, how he broke this blindness curse, and then he was like dating another character, and he was just kind of like this fun guy. And meanwhile, he had this sister who was a real drag. She was very prim and proper and strict. And I thought it would just be fun to pair this character who I had written in kind of an antagonistic light with this fun-loving mob boss guy, because what would happen? What would happen between the two of them? From the perspective of my 20-something self, I felt like they had this amazing chemistry and that their characters like really blossomed in each other's presence immediately. And that Alfred was just like such a full-fledged character from the start. But when I look back on it, it feels incredibly cringy and clunky. Alfred seems really different, a lot more formal, more like he's almost stepped out of like a historical novel. And Livonia really just doesn't even have much of a personality at all. At this point, I was not very good at writing female characters, and I didn't really care for them very much. I had not figured out how to interest myself in my female characters. So poor Livonia was really, I don't want to say she's quite a self-insert character, but she's probably the closest that I ever got to writing a story like that. But you know, I liked to write romances, but I was so much more interested in the male character. He had all the agency, all the more interesting traumas and trials and tribulations, as well as all the greater power and intelligence. And the story about Det and Vera Vissa was particularly glaring in that regard. But that one I wrote when I was like 16. But at the age of 23, I had not gotten as far as I wanted to with writing female characters either. So Livonia just kind of feels like an excuse for me to write about Alfred, despite that she'd kind of gone through an interesting situation herself. But even as I was writing this original story, I remember kind of thinking, she's not that interesting. And by this time I was old enough to know that like I really want the woman to have more going on, for her to have more power to match his and to have more complexity to her background. So shortly after writing this original draft, I completely scrapped her origin story and gave her the origin story that you will know if you read The Potion Dealers, which involves, well, I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't read it, but she's having dreams of another life, shall we say, that was quite complicated. But in this original story, she really does not have a lot going on. She doesn't even seem to have like any ambitions, or like she's a pretty boring character. It's shameful. It's shameful to me when I look back on it how boring Livonia is. Some other things that I did in this manuscript that don't hold up very well. I had a lot of just mundane details going on, like Livonia sat down at her desk, picking up the stack in her inbox. Putting the papers before her, she thumbed quietly through them. A few letters, an insurance form to be signed. Her eyes strayed to the white walls. It's just like, I mean, sometimes you need to set a scene, but there's a lot of that sort of thing where there's just kind of some mundane actions that don't really seem to be going much of anywhere or setting much of a scene, except maybe to say that her life is very boring. And do we want a character's life to be that boring? Clearly in the original draft, I did want her life to be that boring. I emphasize how boring her life is over and over so that I can set up this, I guess, why she would run off with a mob boss. But it doesn't make her very appealing. There's also a lot of just telling you what the character's emotions are, but when they actually interact, I don't think that I feel it as much as when they're just kind of summarizing it later, which is really why that whole show don't tell advice exists, for precisely this kind of thing. But it's subtle because I know that I still kind of do write like this. It's just that I think I've dialed back the telling and increased the showing considerably, and also tried to just punch up the writing in general. Like, her father took things so seriously sometimes. Of course, it was serious in a way. Although her acquaintance with Alfred had been so short, the nature of it made it seem very intense and important. They had not so much as kissed or even had too much in the way of deep conversation. Their sudden bond came from the realization they shared the same goal, a desire for a sort of freedom, for something more, and perhaps she hoped for an honest sort of love. That's the kind of thing that definitely should just be shown in the way they interact. I shouldn't have to tell you that they share the same goal and that they want an honest sort of love. You should definitely already know that by the way that I've written them. And while sometimes you might want to summarize a little bit a character's feelings and their thoughts, I would not write it like that anymore. It's just too many words that don't really say anything that you shouldn't already know. The other thing about this book is it's not really going much of anywhere. It's kind of like the pattern of just maybe like a lighthearted billionaire romance where he's like, I'm going to take you on a vacation and it'll be great. And she's like, wow, I've never been on a fancy vacation before. And he's like, well, now you're spoiled. I'm rich and I'm going to indulge you. That's kind of the whole plot, and nothing else happens except that she finds out that he is from this crime family. And then she's like, why didn't you tell me that your family is so dangerous and, engages in illegal activity and kills people? But there's no real consequences to her finding this out. Like, there's never a point where they have to deal with any danger. There's never a point where she watches him do anything to anybody. Nobody comes after them. No consequences. No follow through on this setup. As far as I got with the manuscript, which I did not finish, there is zero consequences to Alfred being from a dangerous crime family. By the time I got to the version I wrote 10 years later, and then the version that most of you will have read that I wrote last year, both her background and her entanglement with him lead to more consequences. Even though at this point I've kind of branded it as more of a cozy fantasy, so in a lot of ways you maybe don't even need as many consequences, but I think that every book you have to follow through in some way on the promise of these setups. Even if you decide I'm not going to escalate this to like the highest degree that I could because I want it to be more of a comfort read, you still need to like give these people something to do. In the original draft, I didn't really give them much of anything to do. And then there's the dialogue. There's the dialogue. At this point in my life, I was really attached to the idea that the characters are like real, man, and I'm just like kind of channeling what they tell me. So I don't want to like alter their natural voice too much. I don't know why I'm using such a like intense hippie voice here, but yeah, I was really stuck on like, no, whatever they say, that's like what they said. I can't change it too much. Like, I don't want to mess with their voice. I was the very definition of being precious about character voices. But in hindsight, when I read back at this versus like stuff I've written in like the last 10 years, you want to mess with the voice a little bit. You want to try to capture the essence of a character's voice, but you do want the dialogue to not be too real, because otherwise we get exchanges like this. Alfred, she breathed almost inaudibly. Yes, he said with a sly grin, as if he'd been expecting this. I can't sleep. I don't think it's been very long. No, I know. She closed her eyes again. What are you thinking of? He said. She opened her eyes again. She wanted to speak her real thoughts, but she chickened out and said, I don't know. I was thinking, he said. It seems strange I've known you such a short time. Something feels very right about you, to me. Me too, she whispered. Oh, God. Like, yeah, sometimes that is how people talk, with a lot of like, I can't sleep. I don't know. You don't want to write that in a book. A lot of their dialogue, although that is a particularly aggravating example, but a lot of their dialogue just feels like I left everything in, everything a real person would say, and that makes sense because I'm coming from text role playing, which is just literally, actually talking to someone in real time in text. You don't have to hone your dialogue as much in text role playing like you would in fiction. So I was writing like I was text role playing, where you're just like having a real conversation. no, it does not read well. It actually makes your character seem annoying and wishy-washy, and it drags the whole thing down. When I'm writing dialogue, I'm trying to be very careful now about the moments of dialogue that I'm choosing to include, even though, yes, in my head they are still talking like real people, including the boring bits. But the part I'm actually going to put on the page is going to be the good stuff, the good banter, the moments of actual emotional weight. I want to streamline out all the crap so that it doesn't weigh the whole thing down. There are even like the little things, like Alfred uses way too many exclamation points in his dialogue. He's supposed to be, he's an enthusiastic, friendly kind of guy, but in this, well, he does drink a lot of espresso, but he seems so caffeinated. He's just always exclaiming like everything. You don't want to go overboard on the page with stuff like that because it comes across kind of like magnified compared to real life. You might hear the character's voice exclaiming something, but you don't want to actually put like 4 statements in a row with exclamation marks. All in all, looking back at this book, it's kind of just like everything about it is bad. It's not bad in the teenage kind of way. It's just like, ugh, man, it needs a lot more work. And by a lot more work, I mean the entire thing needed to be completely scrapped and reimagined and written from scratch, which is what I eventually did. And this is a common thing when you're working on your early manuscripts, that sometimes the whole thing just isn't working. And I had another book at this around a similar time to this one, where I had someone in a critique group tell me to just scrap this entire world, all the characters, everything, and start fresh. And I did not do that because I loved the characters in the world, and I'm so glad that I didn't. But did they need a whole lot of work as to how I was going to envision them so that they really worked? This story that I wrote, it was not going to work. There was no way to make this redeemable. The whole thing was so messy and poorly crafted from the first paragraph. There was no way I could have ever rewritten it to be anything good. But at the same time, there is enough that is good in it that it can pose a problem when you're in the moment of writing it, trying to figure out, how do I fix this? What is wrong? Why is this not quite working? Maybe I just need to like flesh out this part, tweak this part, edit down this part. It can be hard to know. And that's why in a lot of ways, writing more stuff is the best thing that you can do. The thing that really showed me how to re-envision this book was writing other books. Then I was able to go back and see all the things that this early manuscript was lacking. And of course you want to be studying the craft as you go too, but like, you can't expect this to be a really quick process where like one day you have this big mess of a manuscript that nobody wants to read, and a year later you've just got it all down. That's pretty rare. It's a lot more common for this to just be a slow learning curve where you just get better at things in bits and bobs as you work on different manuscripts, as you keep studying, as you exchange work with other people or work with editors or whatever it is that you're doing. It's not a quick process. When I last looked at this book, it was probably like, well, I really properly rewrote it for the first time in like 2012 or so, maybe. It was about 10 years after I had first written it. And I'd gotten an agent and I wanted her to see it. So I kind of rewrote it for her. And it still wasn't good. It was still pretty damn weird. But I still had a lot more like intention with how I like shaped Livonia's background and how I was planning out the plot. I'd gotten a lot better at a lot of things, so I was kind of like halfway there, or maybe it was a quarter of the way there, I don't know. But at that time, I was only just starting to really have enough distance from the first version to know how to re-envision it well. Even then, I didn't really get it right. So I ended up playing with these characters across so many different drafts and versions that what I ended up with in The Potion Dealers finally feels like what I wanted to write the whole damn time, and yet it is so different from this original manuscript that it almost feels unrecognizable. But it's like from the very beginning of a story, you have this core, you feel something when you're writing it, and you're trying to figure out how to extract that core from the mess surrounding it. And sometimes it's fairly easy. Sometimes it's incredibly difficult. This has especially been my experience with a book like this, which was really a character first, plot second kind of book, that I just couldn't figure out the plot, but also the characters. No matter how good you think the characters are, if you don't have the plot right and you don't have their growth arcs right, they aren't really a good character yet. It's like they were just good characters in an isolated moment in time, but there wasn't a story yet. Disheveled editing, Lydia here with some very unflattering lighting, but whatever. We're going to roll with it anyway. In fact, this unflattering lighting is very on theme now that I think about it. The thing I've been thinking about since I initially recorded this video only a few days ago, but I was thinking about the whole theme. In a lot of ways, I couldn't figure this book out until I really figured out what the core theme was. And that kind of took me a while, because initially I was writing it more just like these characters are fun. Then I started thinking more like on the external plot, the like whole mob boss, magic dealing angle. How is Livonia going to tie into that? You know, just kind of the more action packed, like what's the pitch going to be stuff. But I think the thing that finally clicked for me that made it really work is I realized, like, what is the core theme of all the characters in this story? And it ended up being, I think, in a lot of ways, like deep self-acceptance. And that kind of ties into that very first theme that matured from this book of going from characters that had all these amazing powers and were like, oh, they were always super hot, you know, the teen character. This was the first story where I had written characters that were a little more like their vulnerabilities were a little more real. I remember one of the first drawings I did of Alfred, and Dade was looking at it and he was like, he actually looks blind, which seems a little funny to say, but a lot of blind characters in media don't really look very blind. Like their eyes might look a little weird, but usually not in a very awkward way. And when I drew Alfred, I made him look a little bit awkward. And that was kind of a turning point where I started to write a lot more characters that were just a little awkward. They weren't as attractive, or they weren't as cool. And you can see that in all the characters in this story. Like George, he's not supposed to be super hot. He's kind of awkward too. He was shapeshifted to be really tall, but he's not necessarily like a super hot tall. He's kind of like an awkwardly shapeshifted tall instead. Just kind of a hulking guy with bad posture. Although I think when I draw George, he actually looks pretty cute. It's hard to draw people awkwardly sometimes, but that is the theory. Like Jem's kind of got like a dad bod, and Lester, he's like overly adorable, like not very masculine. I didn't draw Livonia like as the hottest girl. She's kind of just like has sort of a very basic kind of face, and everybody's kind of just dealing with more down to earth problems. So anyway, I realized over time that in writing my characters less overpowered and less beautiful and less immortal and letting them have more real vulnerabilities, even some that sometimes made me feel kind of uncomfortable as I was writing them. They felt a little too vulnerable or a little too real at times, but I started to embrace that more and more. Like I was going on this journey of self-acceptance as each character in the story, like writing them with some real flaws and then learning as that character to like accept myself, which was a very therapeutic thing to do, and hopefully a theme that resonates with readers too, because it's like a struggle with being human that we all go through, that most of us are not the most beautiful immortal fairies with amazing powers. And I like to read those things sometimes too. But over time, I've come to like characters that are a little more relatable, and to still like love them just as much. When I realized that was kind of the core of the story, that each character has to kind of go through this arc of accepting themselves and their very painful pasts, or the ways they feel that they don't fit in, or they're not attractive, or they're not very good socially, as they each learn to accept those things about themselves and stop trying to compromise. That kind of became the core theme, and that's when the book clicked. So, I don't know. That's my rambling about that. I'm hoping what all this does show is how long it can take to really figure out what the heck your book actually is, but that the journey can also be incredibly rewarding. So, those are just some of my reflections looking back on 20 years of Alfred and Livonia. This is pretty embarrassing. It feels very vulnerable to me. I know you're watching it, probably doesn't seem nearly as embarrassing as it does to me, but it does feel very embarrassing. But I always want to be honest about just the growth and how I feel like people don't always talk about this messy part in the middle, where you're not really a beginner and you're not really like professional level. You're in the awkward middle, kind of like the awkward middle of a book. So I feel like this would be a good time to try to talk about that, although I think I just rambled a lot, but I hope it was helpful to someone anyway, relatable maybe to some of you. And yeah, if you haven't read The Potion Dealers yet, you should check it out. Maybe I will post some longer excerpts on my Substack this week, comparing the original version with the final version, and you can laugh at me. If you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. I've been making my living as a creative since 2009, and on this channel, I talk about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. If you'd like more from me, join my Substack, read my books, link in the description. And if you really want more from me, my memberships get you 2 bonus videos per month voted on by you guys. Those are accessed through YouTube, Substack, or Patreon. And thank you so much, as always, to everyone watching, and especially to my members, because you're the whole reason that I am here. And I will see you next time. Bye!